We'll see what are parallel vectors here. In a two-dimensional Cartesian coordinate system, we have taken this as a reference point. Let this be vector A and this be vector B. For vector A and vector B to be parallel vectors, their direction has to be same. So the necessary condition for vector A and vector B to be parallel vectors is that direction of A must be equal to direction of vector B. The magnitude of A may or may not be equal to the magnitude of B. This is a complementary condition which may or may not be, but the necessary condition for vectors A and B to be parallel vectors is that direction of A is equal to direction of vector B. What is negative vector here? Let us consider vector A points towards this direction and vector minus A points towards this opposite direction, where minus A is negative vector of vector A. Now in order to be this negative vector, two conditions must be satisfied here. What are the two conditions here? First condition is direction of A vector must be opposite, that is negative, which means I consider here as opposite direction of negative vector. Magnitude of A must be equal to magnitude of negative vectors. So negative of a vector is a vector whose magnitude is equal but the direction is opposite of that vector. So here minus A is a negative of this vector because the magnitude, the length of this vector is same as the length of this vector, but the direction is opposite. Here two vectors, vector A and vector B, are said to be equal if the direction is same and the magnitude has to be same. So the first condition is direction of A vector is equal to direction of vector B. The second condition is that magnitude of vector A must be equal to magnitude of vector B. We saw in parallel vectors the direction of A must be equal to direction of B, whereas the magnitude may or may not be equal, but in equal vectors the magnitude as well as the direction has to be equal. What are collinear vectors here? Let us consider vector P and vector Q. Vectors P and vector Q to be collinear vectors, they must have to pass from the same line. So the vectors P and Q, if they passes through the same line, they are called collinear vectors. Here the important condition is that they must have to pass through same line. If they passes through same line, their direction are equal. Whereas the magnitude of P may or may not be equal to Q. The major difference between collinear and parallel vectors is that these vectors are parallel vectors as well, but they have to pass through same line. The vectors may or may not have same magnitude. What is unit vector? So vector A is called unit vector if its magnitude is equal to 1. So unit vectors have magnitude 1. They can be represented as a cap or a hat. So same way, vector A can be written as magnitude of A and A cap if A is a unit vector, or it can be simply written as A cap, whereas this and this simply denotes its magnitude. We also know direction of A vector is equal to direction of A cap, whereas this is the unit vector and this is the vector itself. The direction of vector and unit vector same. That's why we can write this equation, because the vector is simply equal to its magnitude, which is 1, and A cap. In two-dimensional plane or two-dimensional coordinate system xy, unit vectors along x and unit vector along y are I cap and j cap. Also, in three-dimensional plane, unit vectors along x, along y and along z, the unit vectors are I, j and k cap. These I, j and k are orthogonal vectors because they all are perpendicular to each other. What is null vector? If vector A is some vector with magnitude, let it be like A equal to 2, then this vector can be a null vector if its magnitude reduces to 0. If magnitude of A becomes 0, then it can be called as null vector. So if we have to define what is null vector, null vectors are those vectors whose magnitude is 0. Now if the magnitude is 0, the starting point and the ending point, that is tail and head, coincide at the same point because the magnitude is 0. If the magnitude is 0 and it is represented by a point, therefore it has no definite direction. It is represented as O capital letter with arrow over its head. What are coplanar vectors? Now this is a whiteboard. Whatever I write on this board is on the same plane. Thereby any number of vectors drawn or plotted or acting over this plane are called coplanar vectors. These vectors, vector A, B, C and D, are said to be coplanar vectors if they act on the same plane. Let us consider a block, this being center of mass and this being origin itself for two-dimensional Cartesian coordinate system. Now this two-dimensional Cartesian coordinate system is a local coordinate system for this block. This being origin as well as the center of mass, F being a vector. Now a vector, to be a localized vector, it must have two conditions satisfied. it must be parallel, and it must pass through same point. Here vector q can be a localized vector because it is parallel to f and passes through the same point as this origin. If we have vector a here, this vector can be represented as this also, unless it has same direction and same magnitude. If its magnitude is given by its length, then this length must be equal. If it is 5 centimeter, it must be 5 centimeter, and it must have same angle. So this vector A is free vector of this vector. This free vector concept is very important in the further classes.